Good afternoon. Today, I must thank Professor Kondo for giving me this opportunity to give a presentation to you all. But I must admit that when I was asked to give a presentation, I was taken aback a bit by what should I give a presentation on, because I had seen many of you give presentations and they had all been of very high standard, and the use of PowerPoints was also very good technically. So I was a little bit taken aback, and so as a scientist, off I went to the literature to find out what other people had done in terms of presentation skills. And when I looked at the literature, I could see that there are many sites that have good booklets or videos or other information on the internet about general presentation skills. So there was no need to repeat a presentation that builds on those general presentation skills. But I have in my handout, I've given some very good videos that I saw about presentation skills and booklets that you can download from the internet if you want to do so. Okay, so having gone through the literature and found that general presentation skills are readily available to you, I next went to some books on presentations, and I come across two very interesting books. One was by Garry on presentation Zen, and the other one was by Heath Brothers called Made to Stick. And it was while reading that I came across a very interesting idea. It's called the curse of knowledge. And today I would like to focus on that curse of knowledge. Okay, so what is the curse of knowledge? Okay, I looked it up on the Wikipedia. And the Wikipedia says, the curse of knowledge is a cognitive bias according to which better informed agents find it extremely difficult to think about problems from the perspective of lesser informed agents. This whole sentence to me sounds like the curse of knowledge. It's very hard to understand. If I put it into simple terms, it would be you may better understand the curse of knowledge is a pattern of judgment that leads to inaccurate assessment of what the audience, who are less knowledgeable than you, can understand. And if you, in your presentations, give a lot of details, that can in fact lead to confusion in the audience. And so when I was thinking about this idea, I could remember a number of presentations where I felt confused because of all the detail on the slides and presentations. So I thought it would be appropriate exercise today to look at the curse of knowledge and how we can overcome that in terms of our presentations. So as you can see here, this is the aeroplane cockpit. And to me, to a pilot, I presume that all these dials and screens mean something to them. But to me, when I look at that, I don't know where to start. I can't see a steering wheel, there's no brake, there's no start key. So to a pilot, it means something. But to me, as somebody who is looking at that, it means nothing, or very little to me. And so, in this case, it's only meant for the pilot. I'm not meant to go in there and do the driving. But in the case of presentations, you are presenting to an audience. And so it's not for you, it's for the audience that you're making the presentation. So it's very important that when you make that presentation, you take into account the audience and prepare your presentation in that respect. Okay, So though in those two books that I mentioned, the Presentation Zen and Made to Stick, they come across 6 principles that they use to ensure that the audience becomes involved in the presentation and understands the presentation. And so they call it the success model, which is the first letter in each of those words spells success. So it's simplicity, unexpectedness, concreteness, credibility, emotions, and stories. Today I don't have enough time to cover all 6 subjects, so I have chosen simplicity and stories today to provide some more information for you in terms of preparing your presentation. And the way I'm going to deal with this is, rather than having me speak all the time, I'm going to try and make it a little bit more interactive. So I am going to use 2 presentations that I came across recently that I thought were very good. And we will use those to look at how did they make the presentations, what structure did they use, and then try a bit of reverse engineering to look at how we can go about making presentations in a similar fashion. Okay, so I will now give you a handout of... Could you help me hand these out, please? Okay, now I'd like you to read through this handout, but in the handout I have mixed up the paragraphs, so they are not in the correct order. So I want you to read through them and try and guess the correct order. So there's a box at the top of the handout. So what is the first introductory sentence? Is it number 6? Is it number 5? And try and work out the correct order for the presentation. And if you have finished, can you discuss this with the person beside you, your partner, and try to explain why you chose that order, if there is a difference between you and your partner. Okay. For the first paragraph, what number did you choose? 2. Everybody got 2? No? What did you get? 4. Okay. For number 2, 6. Okay. And for number 3? 4. Okay. And for number 4? 1. And for number 5? 5. Okay. And the last one? 3. Okay. It is correct. So now I'd like to go through each of those. So please look at number 2 paragraph, and please identify some very important key words. Any key words? Skin. Any other keywords? Burning injury. Okay. Dehydration. Yes. Okay, go on to number 6. What is keywords in number 6? Burning injury. Any others? Healing. Okay, very good. Go on to number 4. Repair. Any others? Research. Okay, our research. Number 4. Number 1. Experiment. Okay. Any others? Human. My results. Okay. And number 5. No? Culture cells. Antibiotics, yes. Or they also use the word new product, which is more general, which the antibiotics is the new product. And the last one, number 3. So yes, so clinical trial. Okay. So what you've identified here is something that is very common in many scientific presentations. So it's, in this case, usually in many presentations they follow a very similar pattern. First, of setting the context, or what is the problem. So in this case, the context is skin and burning injury. And then they go on to say, okay, within that context, there is a problem. And what is that problem? And so here it is, burning injury and healing associated with that injury is the problem. The healing is not going so well in many cases. So in the next one, they come up with a question. Okay, if healing is not occurring so fast in many patients, why is the healing not occurring in many patients? So they look at the repair, and they look at our research. And so it's going from a very broad context, coming down, to define where they're going to do. And so in the next paragraph, it's my experiments, or my research. And it then tells you what research it does. One, first of all, they do it on rats, and they explain why do they do it on the rats. And then when they've got success in the rats, they go on to human culture cells, not humans themselves, but culture cells. And so it's coming down from context through complication, question to hypothesis. And in fact, many research reports and the scientific method itself is like an hourglass. First you start with the context, or what the real world phenomenon is. Then you look at the background, what other people have been doing. Then you start to look at, okay, what is the problem that hasn't been identified? And that's what am I going to do to identify that problem? And then once you've done that, done research, you then present your results. And then looking at your results, you start to expand out again. So here she is also coming from doing the experiments. And in the future, my future research is clinical trials. So she's following this very classical hourglass procedure, which is a way of telling a story that not only the scientific method uses, most business presentations also follow a very similar pattern. And there's one I think that you do well to learn to do for yourself. Okay, having talked about the presentation, I'll now play it for you to listen. And hopefully, having read some of the details, you'll be able to pick up all the details of the presentation.
Students, you see, are very useful. Our PhD this week comes from Adelaide and shows once more how international our campuses have become, which must be a good thing. Here she is.
My name is Nadira Baruzahaji. I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of Adelaide, Department of Physics. I originally come from one of the former Soviet Union republics, Uzbekistan. I was born in Uzbekistan. I was 16 years old when I came to Australia. A new pathway to improve the repair of wounds. The skin is the largest organ in the body. It functions as a barrier against dehydration, keeping the water in and the bacteria out. When large areas of skin are damaged, the barrier function of skin is under threat, making the body vulnerable to infection. Many people suffer from some form of skin disorder, whether it be from a burn injury or an inherited skin disorder. Burn injury is common in children. Each week in Australia, 23 young children go to hospital emergency departments for the treatment of burns. In adults, chronic wounds related to diabetes have become very significant. Diabetes is now the fastest growing chronic disease in Australia. It causes a massive number of health problems, including skin ulceration. Having worked with these patients, I have seen wounds that get bigger and bigger. Too often, the only treatment is amputation. Due to poor outcomes from existing therapies, there were 3,400 lower limb amputations in Australia in 2004 related to diabetes. Obviously, there is an acute need for better therapies for wound healing. Tissue repair and regeneration is a new and expanding area of biomedical research. In our lab, we focus on the development of new treatments that allow the body to restore damaged skin more efficiently. The biology of wound healing is complex. It requires interaction of skin and immune cells which remove bacteria and make proteins. Our research group has identified a protein, and over the past 8 years we have been probing the mysteries of specific functions of this protein. We were the first group in the world to recognise the importance of this protein in the wound healing process. We don't experiment on humans. This is why I use laboratory animals, because they too have their own biology. We manipulate their biology and use mice that are known to have different levels of this protein. These mice look identical on the outside, but on the inside they are programmed to produce different levels of the protein throughout their bodies. We innovated a way to mimic human wounds in mice. My experiments showed that mice lacking this protein heal faster than the mice with high levels of the protein. Taken together, my results suggest that the special protein has the capacity to inhibit healing. This was of great scientific and clinical interest because we now know that too much of this protein in the wound is bad for healing. We also analysed human wounds and cultured cells in the laboratory. We showed that by getting rid of this harmful molecule, we can enhance wound closure. We then targeted this protein for therapy. We developed a product, a cream that contains antibodies which neutralise the harmful activity of this protein. By rendering the protein useless, wounds treated with our antibody-based cream heal quicker. We now want to test the new treatment in a human clinical trial. Depending on the results, it may take another 5 years before this treatment finds its way from the lab bench to the patient bedside. As an improved method of treatment, I hope that one day it could be used in the clinic and help people live longer, more comfortable and happier lives with all 4 limbs still in place.
Nadira Oluzahaji of the University of Adelaide, who's won both the 3MT Prize and a Young Investigator Award for her brilliant work, helping the wounds from burns heal again.
Okay. Next, I'd like to show you a presentation that was made at a TED conference, which are very good sources of scientific presentations, and they also provide sometimes transcripts. So it's a very good resource for learning listening and also presentation skills. While you're listening to this presentation, I don't want you to concentrate on the content, but what I'd like you to look at is how is he making the presentation simple so that the audience can understand what he is talking about. So the presentation is about crop biodiversity, and it basically says 3 main points, only 3 main points. There's lots of diversity, we're losing that diversity, and why is diversity important? They are the 3 points in the presentation. And I'd like you to try and listen to the presentation and identify how he has made the presentation so that the audience can understand it. So it's a scientifically literate audience, but one who is not necessarily a specialist in biodiversity. Okay. When listening to that presentation, did you see any examples of how he made it simple for the audience to understand what he was talking about? Can you give me any examples? No? Oh, well, okay, I'll give some examples I picked up. Was that, for instance, he was talking about lots of diversity, and at the start he gave some big numbers of rice cultivars and wheat cultivars, but I don't remember the numbers that he said. But I do remember he used the example of the slide of the beans, which only had beans on it, didn't have any words or anything else on it, and then he compared it to something the audience would understand, dogs. So he said that there are 400 dogs on that, and it would take 10 slides to show you how many breeds of dogs there are. But for the breeds of beans in the world, if you showed the same slide every second, it would take 15 minutes to show how many beans there are in the world. So he's giving you an example, and for me it was easier to remember the example than to remember the figures. He said no, 10,000, many hundreds of thousands of this breed and that breed, but I didn't remember that. By showing that something that I am familiar with, dog breeds, and then relating that to the beans, it made it much easier for me as the part of the audience to understand that. Also, in terms of loss, he also, at the very start of the talk about losses, he also gave a large number. Again, I don't remember. But he picked out one example, the apples in New York, and then used that to relate about how much loss there has been over a period of 70 to 80 years. So again, he's picking out an example that everybody is familiar with, going to the supermarket and looking at how many varieties of apples there are, and comparing it to that in the past. Also, he's repeating the message many times, but in a different shape. Then he goes to the book about apples and shows that there are, it's a volume 2 of apples in the 1900s. So again, he's pointing out, repeating his message, but not making it monotonous. I've given you a different example, something that is familiar to the audience, and then using that to repeat the message that there's a lot of diversity is being lost in the recent history on the Earth. And then he goes and picks out an example of the Fowler apple, and he uses the Fowler apple to transition into what is the need for diversity. So he uses an example that everybody has heard about, the Fowler apple, because he explained it quite a bit in the presentation, and then talked about, okay, the Fowler apple may not be the best, but if the climate changes, then we may need that. So he's using common examples to transition into the next part of the speech. And finally, when he shows the slides of the temperature in India and South Africa, he could have there's a large number of data and figures that he could have used to show the loss of diversity and the need for diversity. But he picked out an example that was easy to understand. The blue bars and the red bars were quite separate. So even a non-professional biodiversity person could understand how the temperature shift is going to, there's going to be a significant effect on that shift. And his slide that he uses didn't have a lot of information. It wasn't cluttered with lots of detail. It was a simple bar graph and just easy to read numbers only. So again, he's thinking about the audience and how can the audience understand that message that he wants to get across. So, this morning in the talk, we had a special lecture about the latest technology in infrared and terahertz sensors. And in that talk, there was quite a bit of discussion about the signal-to-noise ratio. And so I presume that a lot of you are familiar with signal-to-noise ratio. In the presentation, you can also apply the signal-to-noise ratio. But you have to remember it's the noise of your audience, not your noise. So because of the curse of knowledge, you understand a lot of information about your subject, and when you're presenting a slide, all of that information is of pertinence to you. But to the audience, it may not be that clear. And a very good image this morning was, it showed a man in the quite some distance away, and in the visible sensor, you could just see him, but then when you put smoke in front of the sensor, you couldn't see it. But for the terahertz sensor, you could see the person, even with the smoke. So the terahertz sensor is getting the information that is necessary and not being distracted by all the smoke. Whereas in the visible sensor, which is your audience, the audience, in this case the visible sensor, is being distracted by all the smoke, and so it can't get the details of the information from your presentation if there is too much detail in there. again, it's just a simple example of a graph up the top there. It's technically very good, uses a nice background, it's three-dimensional, it's putting on a slope, but again, it's very difficult to get what information you need. You can convey the same information and make it more easier for the audience if you have done it just by a simple graph like this. So again, the take-home message from today's talk is, in order for your audience to remember your presentation, tell a story and keep it simple. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions?
Thank you for your presentation. According to our special lecture this morning, we saw that too many information in one slide, for example, formula, graphics, figures. Do you think that's not good for a presentation, or what do you think?
Okay. For me, it was too much information. This is not my specialty area, and so I don't know whether he understood that I would be there in the audience. But I cannot say for you people. Again, what I'm saying here in the presentation is that it's very important to consider who you're presenting to in the audience, and then to craft your presentation to make sure that the audience gets a high signal-to-noise ratio and has a message that they can take home. But because of the curse of knowledge, because I remember when I first came to Japan, and I was asked to, because I'm a native English speaker, I was asked to correct English reports and presentations, etc. And one of the biggest impressions I got was, oh, this is a lot easier than when I'm having to write my own. I used to sweat and sweat and trying to rewrite my own presentation, but when it was somebody else's, because I'm not, I don't have a investment in that information, it was a lot easier for me to see what was necessary and what was not necessary. So again, I think it depends on the case by case, but certainly aim for a high signal-to-noise ratio.
Any other question?
Actually, during last year experiment, I had some class. So some tutors say you have to split your time, like based on introduction, based on methodology, based on conclusion, and there's a discussion. So suppose one presentation time is 12 minutes. So how can we split this
Okay.
time?
Usually in the introduction, where you're trying to set the context, it's usually only about 1 or 2 minutes of just trying to set the context and then go towards the details of your hypothesis, what you're testing, and then the results of that. And then in the summary, again, it's usually only 1 or 2 minutes. So in between those 4 minutes of introduction and conclusion is the main body of the text. But also, in that respect, I would, rather than time, I would try to emphasize that focus on 1 or 2 key points. A lot of people, they do, including myself, got involved in the experiment and did lots of detailed experiments, and I wanted to present everything to the audience. But again, a presentation isn't about what I want, it's a contribution to the audience. And so how can you make the contribution to the audience in such a way that the audience gets as much as possible from the presentation?